At precisely 9:15 p.m. last Thursday, Donald Trump made phone calls that rattled the Republican Party to its core. But these weren't routine check-ins. These were confrontations. Furious, threatening calls that shocked GOP senators and revealed a growing divide within the party. In the next several minutes, I'm going to take you inside those calls and show you how one moment could signal the end of Trump's iron grip on the GOP. Because what happened that night wasn't just about military power. It was about loyalty, control, and the future of the Republican Party. And the fallout is only just beginning. Picture this. Multiple Republican senators sitting in their homes, receiving calls on their personal cell phones. No warning. No scheduling through normal channels. Just Trump, dialing them directly from Mar-a-Lago, his voice already raised before they even finished saying hello. According to 3 sources with direct knowledge of these conversations and 2 others briefed immediately afterward, the fury was unlike anything they'd heard from him in months. We're talking about explicit threats, demands for absolute loyalty, and a president who felt his command authority slipping away in real time. What triggered this explosion? A resolution introduced by Senator Rand Paul that would restrict Trump's ability to authorize military action without congressional approval. Sounds procedural, right? Almost boring. But here's what you need to understand. This resolution represents something far more dangerous to Trump than any policy disagreement. It's a direct challenge to his power at the exact moment he's escalating military rhetoric about Greenland, Venezuela, and multiple other targets. And when Donald Trump senses his authority being questioned, he doesn't negotiate. He attacks. Now, before I take you word by word through what was actually said on those calls, you need to understand what was building in the days leading up to that explosive Thursday night. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. This has been brewing for weeks. And the pressure has been mounting in ways most people haven't fully grasped. For weeks, Trump has been escalating his public rhetoric about military intervention. Greenland has become an obsession. Venezuela keeps coming up in conversations with Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. There have been whispers about Panama, Cuba, and other locations that fit into what some advisors are calling a new doctrine of American territorial assertiveness. This isn't random bluster. This is systematic, deliberate positioning. And behind it all, pulling the strings, amplifying the message, is Stephen Miller, who has emerged as the administration's most aggressive voice on foreign intervention. Miller's worldview is simple. American strength requires projecting dominance. Projecting dominance sometimes requires force. He's not interested in diplomatic nuance or alliance management. He wants outcomes. And he believes military pressure is the most effective tool available. But here's the problem they're running into. Congress still exists. The Constitution still exists. And the War Powers Resolution of 1973 still explicitly requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces and limit such action to 60 days. Without congressional extension, this has been a source of tension for decades, with presidents of both parties testing those limits. But what changed recently, what made Thursday night inevitable, is that Republicans started pushing back. Not Democrats. Republicans. Senator Rand Paul introduced his resolution 3 weeks ago, explicitly reaffirming congressional war powers and requiring authorization before any military action in non-combat zones. At first, it seemed symbolic. The kind of gesture Paul makes regularly that gets a few co-sponsors and quietly dies. But then something unexpected happened. Other Republicans started signing on. Mike Lee of Utah added his name immediately. Todd Young of Indiana, typically a party loyalist, joined. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska signed on. And then Tom Tillis of North Carolina, a mainstream Republican facing re-election in a swing state, added his support. Within 10 days, the resolution had 12 Republican co-sponsors. That's not a majority, but it's enough to create serious problems. It's enough to signal that restraint on Trump's military ambitions might actually have institutional support. And that terrified Trump. Because if this resolution gains momentum, it doesn't just block specific military actions. It fundamentally constrains his ability to project strength through the threat of force, which has become absolutely central to his political identity. That's why Thursday night happened. Trump had been watching that co-sponsor list grow. His team had been dismissing it publicly, but privately, Trump was seething. And when Trump gets that angry, he doesn't delegate. He picks up the phone himself. So let me take you inside those calls because the details matter. The first call went to Senator Rand Paul around 9 p.m. It lasted approximately 8 minutes, and it was confrontational from the first second. Trump didn't start with small talk. He didn't ease into it. According to one source familiar with the call, Trump immediately demanded to know why Paul was undermining the commander-in-chief and making America look weak in front of enemies. Paul, who has never been easily intimidated, pushed back immediately, arguing that defending the Constitution wasn't undermining anything. It was fulfilling his oath of office. That's when Trump's tone shifted from frustrated to openly hostile. The sources describe it as escalating rapidly, his voice getting louder, his words getting sharper. Trump reportedly told Paul that if this resolution moved forward, Paul would be finished in Republican politics. That Trump would personally campaign against him. That Paul's libertarian base would abandon him once they understood he was blocking Trump's ability to protect American interests. Paul remained calm but firm, telling Trump he'd been elected to defend constitutional principles, not to rubber-stamp executive overreach. The call ended abruptly. Trump hung up without saying goodbye. No, that might seem like a small detail, but people who know Trump say it's a tell. When he hangs up mid-conversation, it means he's lost control of the interaction, and he knows it. He couldn't intimidate Paul. He couldn't bully him into submission. And that failure set the tone for everything that followed. The second call went to Senator Mike Lee. This one lasted about 12 minutes and followed an almost identical pattern. Trump opened aggressively, questioning Lee's loyalty, suggesting Lee was being manipulated by Democrats and the media. Lee, deeply committed to constitutional conservatism, wasn't swayed. He reportedly told Trump that war powers weren't negotiable, that the founders deliberately placed them in Congress, and that no personal loyalty could override that structural principle. Trump's response was to question Lee's intelligence, to suggest Lee didn't understand the threats America faces, that he didn't grasp the strategic necessity of keeping military options open. Lee, known for his meticulous legal reasoning, walked Trump through the constitutional framework, explaining why the resolution was not only appropriate but necessary. Trump, growing more frustrated by the second, eventually ended the call by telling Lee he was making a huge mistake and would regret opposing the administration. But here's where it gets really interesting. The third call went to Senator Todd Young, and this one revealed something crucial about Trump's desperation. Young is not a confrontational figure. He's a mainstream conservative, a former Marine, someone who generally avoids public fights with party leadership. But Young had signed on to the resolution, and Trump wanted to know why. According to sources, Trump's approach with Young was different, more transactional than hostile. He asked Young what it would take to remove his name from the resolution. He suggested there could be benefits for Young's state: infrastructure funding, defense contracts, things the administration could deliver. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was negotiation born from weakness. Trump was trying to buy Young's loyalty because he couldn't command it. And Young didn't take the bait. He told Trump this wasn't about deal-making. It was about institutional authority. He explained that as a veteran, he understood the gravity of military action and believed Congress needed to be involved in those decisions. Trump, frustrated by Young's refusal to negotiate, reportedly told him, You're going to regret this when the midterms come around. The fourth and fifth calls went to senators whose names sources would not confirm, but who are believed to be Lisa Murkowski and Tom Tillis. Both calls followed similar patterns. Trump alternated between threats and offers, between personal attacks and appeals to party loyalty. In every single case, the senators held firm. And in every single case, Trump ended the call angry, convinced he was being undermined by people who owed him their political survival. But here's what makes Thursday night different from every other Trump confrontation with lawmakers over the past decade. None of them backed down. Not one. Think about that for a moment. In previous years, when Trump applied this kind of pressure, Republicans would fold. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. They'd find a way to quietly withdraw support, to avoid the confrontation, to give Trump what he wanted while saving face. Thursday night, that didn't happen. Every senator Trump called stood their ground. So what does that tell us? It tells us something fundamental has shifted. And that shift goes beyond this one issue. It goes to the very heart of how Trump has controlled the Republican Party for nearly a decade. Trump's entire grip on the GOP has rested on one powerful tool: fear. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of political destruction. Fear that Trump would endorse a primary challenger. Fear that he would turn his base against them. Fear that defying him would end their careers. And for years, that fear was completely rational because Trump had demonstrated repeatedly that he would follow through. Jeff Flake found out. Bob Corker found out. Any number of Republicans who challenged Trump and found themselves politically exiled learned that lesson the hard way. But here's the thing about fear. It's a resource that depletes over time, especially when the threats stop materializing the way they used to. And over the past year, something has changed in the Republican Party. Trump's endorsement record in primaries has gotten shakier. Candidates he backed have lost winnable races. His legal troubles have multiplied, draining resources and attention. His polling numbers, while still strong among his base, have softened the margins. And Trump himself has shown signs of vulnerability. Cognitive slips, rambling speeches, moments of confusion that make him seem less invincible than he once appeared. When fear weakens, obedience weakens. And when obedience weakens, leaders start testing boundaries. That's exactly what we're seeing with this War Powers resolution. Senators like Rand Paul and Mike Lee have always been skeptical of executive power, so their involvement isn't shocking. But when someone like Todd Young, an establishment Republican with no history of rebellion, signs onto a resolution that directly challenges Trump's authority, that signals the calculus has fundamentally changed. Young isn't worried about Trump's threats anymore. Or at least, he's more worried about the constitutional and political consequences of blind loyalty. And this matters enormously because presidential power, especially on national security issues, depends heavily on congressional deference. When Congress pushes back, when lawmakers start asserting their own authority, the president's freedom of action narrows dramatically. Trump can still give orders, but if Congress refuses to fund them, refuses to authorize them, or actively blocks them through legislation, those orders become exponentially harder to execute. Here's the deeper problem Trump faces. Once lawmakers realize they can defy him without immediate political death, others will follow. This is how political coalitions fracture. Not through dramatic breaks or public splits, but through a gradual erosion of fear, a slow accumulation of small rebellions that eventually add up to a complete loss of control. Trump sensed this Thursday night. That's why he made those calls personally instead of having staff handle it. That's why he was so furious. Because he understands what's at stake. If Republicans stop fearing him, he stops controlling them. And if he stops controlling them, his entire political model collapses. Now let's talk about why this specific issue, War Powers, is so incredibly consequential. Because on the surface, it might seem like just another political fight. Republicans squabbling over procedure while the real action happens elsewhere. But that's not what this is. This is a fight over one of the most fundamental questions in American democracy. Who gets to decide when the country goes to war? The Constitution is explicit about this. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the power to declare war. The framers made this choice deliberately. They had just fought a revolution against a king who could drag the nation into conflict on a whim, and they were determined the new American system would be different. War-making authority would rest with the legislature, the branch closest to the people, not with a single executive who might be motivated by personal ambition or temporary passion. But over the past century, that constitutional design has eroded significantly. Presidents have found ways to commit troops without formal declarations of war, using terms like police actions, peacekeeping missions, or counterterrorism operations to bypass congressional approval. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was supposed to restore some balance, but presidents of both parties have treated it more like a suggestion than a binding constraint. Trump's approach to war powers has been particularly aggressive. During his first term, he authorized military strikes in Syria without congressional approval. He escalated drone operations significantly. He came close to conflict with Iran, all while arguing that his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief gave him wide latitude to act unilaterally. Now, in his second term, with rhetoric about Greenland, Venezuela, and other targets intensifying, the question of limits has become urgent. What Senator Rand Paul's resolution does is force that question into the open. It says, clearly and explicitly, that military operations in non-combat zones require congressional authorization. It doesn't prevent the president from defending the country in emergencies. It doesn't tie his hands if America is attacked. But it does require deliberation, debate, and democratic accountability before committing troops to offensive operations. Trump views this as an unacceptable constraint because his entire foreign policy strategy depends on the credible threat of military force. If adversaries know Trump can't actually pull the trigger without going to Congress first, the threat loses its power. Deterrence weakens. Negotiating leverage disappears. And Trump's preferred tactic, threatening overwhelming force until the other side backs down, becomes much harder to execute. But the Constitution doesn't care about Trump's preferred tactics. The framers deliberately made war-making difficult, slow, and collective precisely because they understood how dangerous concentrated military authority could be. They knew that individuals, even well-meaning ones, could make catastrophic decisions in moments of passion or political pressure. They wanted structural friction built into the system, forcing leaders to justify their actions, build coalitions, and face consequences if they got it wrong. So where does this go from here? Because Thursday night's phone calls didn't resolve anything. They exposed the conflict, brought it into the open, and made it clear that Trump and a growing number of Senate Republicans are on a collision course. But the actual outcome remains terrifyingly uncertain. Let me walk you through what could happen next. Because the possibilities range from quiet de-escalation to full constitutional crisis. Trump could back down quietly. His team could recognize that pushing too hard on war powers will cost them more than it gains. They could signal to Senate allies that the administration isn't planning imminent military action anyway, making the resolution less urgent. Behind the scenes, they work to peel off a few co-sponsors, enough to prevent it from reaching the floor for a vote. Trump continues his aggressive rhetoric publicly, but avoids actual confrontation with Congress. This is the path of least immediate damage. But here's the problem. It requires Trump to exercise restraint, to prioritize long-term strategic positioning over short-term ego satisfaction. And Trump's entire political career suggests that's not how he operates. When challenged, he escalates. When threatened, he attacks. Quiet retreats aren't his style. Or the resolution could actually pass. It could gain enough momentum to reach the Senate floor, and pass with bipartisan support. Republicans who signed on hold firm, joined by Democrats eager to limit executive authority. If that happens, it sends an unmistakable political signal. It tells Trump that Congress won't rubber-stamp military adventures. It tells allies that America's war-making process still involves democratic accountability. And it tells adversaries that Trump's threats may not be as credible as he wants them to believe. Trump would react with absolute fury. He'd denounce the resolution as unconstitutional. He'd probably threaten legal action. He'd definitely launch political attacks on every Republican who supported it. But the resolution would stand, and Trump would have to operate within its political constraints. Maybe not legally, but practically. But there's a third possibility. And this is what worries constitutional scholars most. Trump could decide to force the issue by authorizing military action without congressional approval, deliberately testing whether Congress will actually stop him. Maybe it's a limited strike in Venezuela, framed as counterterrorism. Maybe it's a military presence in Greenland, framed as defensive positioning. The specifics don't matter as much as the challenge. Trump dares Congress to stop him. If that happens, we enter genuinely uncharted territory. Does Congress invoke the War Powers Resolution and demand withdrawal? Do courts get involved, issuing injunctions or rulings on presidential authority? Do military leaders face impossible choices about following orders that lack congressional backing? This scenario doesn't just threaten Trump's presidency. It threatens the constitutional structure itself. Because once that kind of confrontation begins, there's no easy way to de-escalate. And here's what we need to understand about where Trump is right now, because this war powers fight is really a proxy for something much larger. It's a stress test of Trump's actual authority within the Republican Party at a moment when that authority is under more pressure than at any point since 2016. Think about what else is happening simultaneously. Mike Johnson publicly distanced himself from Trump's Greenland rhetoric. Multiple Republicans have resigned or announced they won't seek re-election. Trump's legal troubles continue to pile up. His polling numbers show softening at the edges. All of these are signs of erosion, the slow wearing away of political capital that once seemed inexhaustible. And here's the thing about political capital. It's not like money in a bank account that you can spend carefully over time. It's more like a reputation. Once people start doubting it, the doubt spreads quickly. Once fear starts to fade, it fades fast. Trump built his political movement on the perception of invincibility, on the idea that he always wins, that his opponents always lose, and that defying him is political suicide. But that perception requires constant reinforcement. Every time Trump gets challenged and doesn't crush the challenger, the perception weakens. Every time he makes a threat and doesn't follow through, his credibility erodes. Thursday night, Trump made explicit threats to 5 Republican senators. He told them they'd be finished in politics. He promised to campaign against them. He suggested they'd regret their decisions. And all 5 senators shrugged and held their ground, not because they suddenly stopped caring about their political survival, but because they no longer believe Trump can deliver on those threats the way he once could. This is the beginning of what political scientists call a preference cascade. The moment when political actors who privately disagreed with a dominant figure suddenly feel safe expressing that disagreement publicly because they see others doing the same. It's how political coalitions fall apart, not through dramatic splits, but through a cascading series of small defections that accelerate over time. We're not at a full cascade yet. Trump still commands significant loyalty within the party, but the War Powers Resolution and the defiance it represents shows that the conditions for a cascade are forming. More Republicans are willing to break with Trump on substantive issues. More are willing to withstand his anger. And more are calculating that their political futures might actually be safer without his endorsement than with it. That calculation is everything. For years, Republicans believed they needed Trump more than he needed them. But if that flips, if individual Republicans start seeing independence from Trump as an asset rather than a liability, then Trump's leverage disappears almost overnight. And once leverage disappears, power follows. So here's where we are right now. Last Thursday night, Donald Trump made a series of furious phone calls to Republican senators, trying to bully them into withdrawing support from a resolution that would limit his war-making authority. Every single one of them refused. That refusal, those 5 individual acts of defiance, might seem small in isolation, but together they represent something much larger. The first visible cracks in Trump's control over the Republican Party he built. This isn't about policy anymore. It's not about whether military action in Greenland or Venezuela makes strategic sense. It's about power, its limits, its fragility. And what happens when a leader who built everything on intimidation discovers that intimidation no longer works the way it used to? The War Powers Resolution will continue moving through the Senate. More Republicans may sign on. Trump will continue to push back, probably with increasing desperation. And at some point, possibly very soon, we'll reach a moment of decision where either Trump backs down or Congress does. That moment will define not just this presidency, but the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches for years to come. What happened Thursday night matters because it showed that Republican senators are no longer automatically afraid of Donald Trump. They're still cautious. They're still calculating. But they're no longer paralyzed by fear. And once fear disappears, everything changes. The entire foundation shifts. Trump's angry phone calls weren't a show of strength. They were an admission of weakness. Because strong leaders don't need to threaten. They don't need to rage. They command obedience through respect, through results, through demonstrated competence. Trump is commanding through fear. And fear, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. The next few weeks will tell us whether this moment was an anomaly or a turning point. Whether Trump can reassert control or whether Republican defiance will spread. Whether the War Powers Resolution is just a symbolic gesture or the beginning of meaningful congressional pushback. But after Thursday night, one thing is absolutely certain. The dynamic has shifted. The cracks are visible. And once cracks appear in structures built on fear and intimidation, they tend to spread very, very quickly. If the GOP fractures now, where does that leave Trump's future? Where does that leave America's political future? What happens when the president's power starts to slip and even the most loyal Republicans start pushing back? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. These are questions being answered in real time, right now, as this constitutional crisis unfolds before our eyes. So I want to hear from you. Do you think Republican senators will hold firm on this War Powers Resolution, or will Trump find a way to bring them back in line? Have we reached the actual breaking point? Or is this just another temporary rebellion that will fade when the pressure increases? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know what you're seeing, what you're thinking about this moment. And if this deep analysis helped you understand what's really happening beyond the surface-level headlines. If you now see the bigger picture behind Trump's fury and what it reveals about his weakening grip on power, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update, because I promise you, this story is far from over. The war powers fight is heating up. The constitutional stakes are enormous, and the consequences will ripple through American politics for months, maybe years to come. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.